Hello and welcome to the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast, where we interview business leaders and emerging market experts on business innovations, market opportunities, and macro-level trends in emerging and frontier market countries. Join us for the next hour to dive deep into the world of emerging markets as we speak with top performers who are successfully investing, working, and living in these markets themselves. Welcome to the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Law, and I'm here today with Darren Lapp. Darren is CEO at the New Forest Company, which is a socially responsible, sustainable forestry and timber products business with plantations in Uganda and Tanzania. The New Forest Company was founded back in 2004 with a vision of creating a sustainable timber resource in East Africa amidst rampant deforestation. Darren himself has over 20 years of success in the forest products and renewables industry, and his geographic experience covers North and South America, Europe, and sub-Saharan Africa. So really excited to learn more about your work. I think it's a very important topic that I know very little about, and we haven't covered it yet on the podcast. So I'm excited just to learn as much as possible and learn more from you and your long career in this industry. I think maybe a good place to start, though, would just be your initial interest in forestry. I remember you mentioned to me when we talked before that you grew up in a forestry community in Canada, but you didn't think that that's what you were going to do. When you went to college, you studied biological sciences and history, but then you ended up still going into forestry and soil science. So I was kind of interested in what sparked that interest, and maybe if you can just give an overview of forestry and why it was an exciting career for you and why others might be interested in it as well.
Sure, Nick. Well, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure. So you're correct. I was lucky enough to grow up in a beautiful little town in the heart of the Rockies, near the height of the land of the Rockies in British Columbia, Canada. And it was primarily a forestry town. That was the main industry. And I had older siblings who worked in the industry. I was lucky enough to work in mills, timber mills through high school, specifically a plywood mill and a sawmill. And they were very good to many of us students. A number of us paid our way through university by working summers there. I never really thought that I would end up working in the industry. I did biology more with the intention of doing medicine or something in the biomedical field. But I ended up, after my undergraduate degree, consulting to the forest industry in my hometown. And I really enjoyed it. Growing up in that part of the world, you're pretty disposed to being outdoors and, hiking and tramping around in the woods. And so I enjoyed that part of it, but there was a great deal of thinking and strategic planning and math involved, which I like. So I started consulting to the forest industry there, and eventually had an opportunity to go back and do essentially the professional forestry courses. So there's a certifying body in Canada for professional foresters. So I started down that route and ended up really embedding myself in the sector, I suppose, after a number of years.
Definitely. I think it's something I've always been looking for is how can I actually use what I've learned in school and have that intellectual challenge, but not have to be behind a computer all day. And so being able to be outdoors and hike sounds like an awesome career. And it's cool that you found that. I think that what's really interesting about forestry is that you mentioned there's math, there's strategic planning, you're dealing with multiple stakeholders, whether that's the communities involved or the corporations, et cetera. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those challenges and opportunities of planning forestry projects.
Sure. So there are a couple of different types of forestry tenure. So the common one in the United States, for example, and much of Europe is typically privately held land. And you'll always have other stakeholder interests, but things tend to be a little easier and cleaner. In other geographies, Canada being one, but also sub-Saharan Africa, most of the tenure is longer term government leases. And so you are really in a situation where you have to consider the roles of other stakeholders, whether they're communities embedded within the forest area, other industrial stakeholders, to use Canadian examples, very common to have oil and gas or mining industry as other stakeholders, recreational users. And so you want to develop integrated management plans in a consultative fashion that consider the needs of all of these other stakeholders. Africa presents some unique challenges because typically when you're doing forestry, you're dealing with large land base areas. And in productive, fertile areas, there's invariably going to be people there and interested in the area. And so integrating the needs of the people that are there, communities that are already there, with the objectives of the company becomes an interesting challenge. And so there's a great deal of consultation involved and trying to set mutually beneficial and agreeable targets for what to do with the area, how to create employment, providing opportunities for people and communities as you're developing your business in that part of the world in particular.
Sure. And I think that that's really special about New Forest Company's approach, is that that's something you definitely take into consideration a lot. I was wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit about how your approach may be different from other forestry companies in Africa or just in the world.
Sure, Nick, thanks. Maybe to the African example, I've been lucky enough to be bouncing around the continent for 11 or so years now and had an opportunity to look at a number of different forestry operations, a number of our peer companies. And we have all sort of learned as we've grown and evolved from the time of, planting the first trees to engaging with communities, actually in reverse order, usually engage with the communities before you plant the trees, and really evolving in a number of the social programs as well. I think what New Forest Company has done very well is embed in its DNA the need to be thinking first about creating agency with communities rather than dependency. So there is a very understandable tendency, I think, for a lot of companies to come in, deal with community leadership, say, we're here to build a clinic, we'll do this, and it's very transactional. But I think we want to be looking forward in a way where communities and the company are supporting each other in terms of the objectives. So fire prevention, reducing theft, creating jobs, creating opportunities, and sort of allowing the communities to develop along with you rather than keeping a strictly transactional approach to things. I do think that's something the company has done very well over the years.
Amazing. I think that definitely is the way that things should be done. And I remember you were also talking about your experience in South America. I think it was Uruguay, where you saw the community developing over time, and that showed you how helpful forestry can be. And I was wondering if you could just maybe expand on that a little bit, and if that or any other influences made you take this direction in life and decide to come out to Africa. I'd love to learn more about your international experiences and how you ended up wanting to have that social focus and also leaving Canada, being in South Africa.
Sure. I think that if I were being honest, I took a more technical and business-focused approach to forestry when in Canada. I had a manager at the time who put me in a role where I had to manage public advisory groups, which at the time I sort of felt it was cruel and unusual punishment. But I actually learned a great deal interacting with these different stakeholders, Indigenous communities that were on the leased land base that we were working on in Canada. And so I learned a great deal from that. But it was when I first moved to South America in 2008 where you could really see the positive impact that an industry like forestry had, because it wasn't simply focused on extraction. It was a much longer term process and focus of developing land, improving the quality of the trees, training people, creating employment. And I think that the example I shared earlier, Nick, was in the course of a matter of years, as we started particularly to install industry plywood mills, you would see people going from walking to work to riding bicycles to work to riding motos to work. The quality of the housing was improving so that people were no longer sleeping on dirt floors. And this evolution actually happened very quickly. And I was impacted by that. It was quite a thing to see what the implementation of forestry laws could do that promoted the development of such an industry. And so in Africa, most of the areas that we're dealing with are very rural, generally quite poor communities. And to be able to provide employment, to be working with communities in collaborative programs that create some income for one, provide different programs related to providing microfinance, and really seeing communities develop around the industry. It's very gratifying and heartwarming to see.
Sure. I'm sure it must be really rewarding to be able to be part of something like that. I was wondering if you could also talk about the sustainable aspect of the way that you do forestry as well. I think it's pretty clear that there's definitely that huge social impact there of working with the communities beyond just providing them stable income, which in itself offers so much in terms of development. But in terms of sustainable practices, what do you do differently than maybe a traditional forestry company would do?
Sure. So in the Northern Hemisphere, and I would say in South America and in a lot of Asia as well, there is sort of a de facto movement towards sustainable practices or responsibly managed forests. That hasn't been the history in Africa. It's been such a huge forest resource that it has been, with few exceptions, primarily exploited over the years, and the forested land cover is significantly decreased. So we are one of a handful of companies that is actually replanting areas that have had their forest cover removed. I often speak to people and say that I do forestry in sub-Saharan Africa, and they sort of default to, are you logging rainforests? And it's very much not a case of that. It's plantation forestry, and we're working on rehabilitation of native forest conservation areas. But the sustainable element in that environment is actually, I won't say it's new, but I would say it's uncommon or less common. So we have certification that we use primarily in Africa. It's Forest Stewardship Council, which is a global certification. That's kind of the de facto standard in sub-Saharan Africa. And if one can demonstrate to FSC's auditors that you are managing the forests in a responsible fashion, that you are obeying local and international laws and regulations, international labor organization, you are engaging with communities, you are monitoring biodiversity, then you're eligible to achieve this certification. And we are one of a handful, I think 2 or 3 in East Africa that have this certification. What it does is allows investors to feel confident that we are not, exploiting, depleting rainforests, or, the intention is that there is a long-term sustainable business, both for the company itself, but also the communities and governments that we're working with. But it also increasingly, in a region where many multinationals have sort of glossed over their own sustainability policies when working in pioneer geographies, there's actually a product that we're now able to provide multinationals in terms of having proof of responsibly managed forests. So for their supply chain management, it's becoming increasingly interesting for a company like ours, because we are sort of finding routes to market that we didn't have several years ago amongst these multinational players who are now under shareholder pressure to abide by their sustainability policies everywhere and not just in the developed world.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. I actually had a previous guest who's doing private equity in Africa, and I asked him about ESG or impact-focused investing in Africa. And he was saying basically at this point you have to invest in companies or turn your companies into ESG companies in Africa, because if you try to sell them to the international market, no one's going to buy them unless they are meeting those standards. So it is pretty interesting that across the board that seems to be true. I guess speaking of investors, I know that you were saying that the type of financing for forestry would be different from other industries. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and why the business model of forestry necessitates a different type of investor than other businesses.
Sure. Maybe to sort of step back globally, forestry is often considered to be an interesting investment because, one, it tends to be counter-cyclical to the rest of the market. But unlike to use mining or oil and gas, for example, where you have an asset and ultimately your focus is on optimally reducing that asset to create revenue. Forestry is one where if you plant the tree and you choose not to harvest it at 10 years, it's actually just going to put on value because it keeps growing. So it's the paradox of having a biological asset that keeps putting on value. There are cash flow reasons why you might want to harvest the tree, but eventually it just keeps building up on the balance sheet. So typically returns in forestry are not huge. You're not going to get FMCG type returns. You're not going to get tech type returns, but it's usually a fairly consistent yield through time. I think one of the challenges I would say in sub-Saharan Africa is because it is a developing geography, Nick, I know we're an emerging markets podcast. A lot of the geographies that we're working in, I would actually say they're one step away from even being considered an emerging market.
Sure.
And I think the industry also is quite nascent. The responsibly managed industry in the region is also quite nascent. So originally, ourselves and some of our peer companies had essentially angel investors or high net worth people who wanted to replant trees in an area that was losing its trees. They wanted to create jobs and have a positive social impact. And so that was sort of the first wave of investors. And then we had a wave of development finance banks, primarily European development finance banks, also focused with large ESG goals, but it tended to be debt. And it tended to be debt that actually usually outpaced the industry's normal returns. And so a number of companies have spent a few years restructuring their balance sheets as a result of this. But the next wave of investors that we're seeing, and unfortunately, I can't quite yet share who this is, but we actually just closed a significant deal on Friday last week with an investor who's coming in, and the focus is on nature-based solutions. So it is timber, it is carbon sequestration, it's biodiversity. It certainly maintains the impact focus in terms of job creation and benefit sharing for communities in the region. But we're seeing that as the next likely wave of investors is the big multinationals who have very noble and lofty ESG goals, engaging with companies like ours and supporting us on the next step of this journey.
Amazing. Congratulations, first of all. And secondly, I think it does make sense to have investors like that who have aligned values and are probably in it for the long term as well. So it makes sense. Something I saw that was on your website and I was curious about was that you talked about reversing the trend of exporting raw materials and importing value-added products into East Africa. It's really interesting to see how you're doing that as a forestry company. Would love to learn more about that initiative and what your goals are with that.
Sure. So the region, despite having, great capacity to grow trees, the biological capacity is fantastic, has typically exported raw material or near raw material to various parts of it. Well, basically all of the other continents. And yet, in terms of finished product, you would see much more import happening into the region than export. A few years ago, I actually had an example where we were selling raw logs from initially the business started, we intended to put in more industrial capacity, but we were selling old raw logs, eucalyptus, from a West African country, exporting them to China, and we were getting plywood back from China. And that was made from literally the same trees in some cases. So there's really an opportunity to be moving into servicing our own markets in East Africa. One of the challenges is there's a real price sensitivity. So if someone wants to use a piece of plywood, I'm generalizing, of course there are exceptions, but typically if someone wants a piece of plywood or a board, they will get the cheapest one that they possibly can in sub-Saharan Africa, or at least in this region. Whether it is got any form of certification or safety standards or even quality standards, as long as it's cheap. And so what we would like to see is increased pickup from multinationals again, from global construction companies who are interested in multiple uses of these products, and they have a focus on this responsible management or proof of responsible management. So what we've been doing is making some inroads into the wooden pallet market. Most of the multinationals in the region, you can imagine who they are, the soft drink and the beer companies, et cetera, a number of the food companies all use wooden pallets. And we are starting to see a preference for certified responsibly managed products. So this is one of the markets that we're actively trying to move into or actively trying to increase our share. We do have other products such as high value eucalyptus products. So in other geographies, you might see this very high quality yucca used as flooring or furniture. And we've actually got the capacity to do this we don't have the technology or at this point the skill to sort of take it from raw material to finished cabinet, but we can take it from sort of step 1 to 6 instead of step 1 to 10. And then we may need to do some exporting. So Malaysia or other places can do the finishing and the final product. But there's significant upside to be had in terms of producing in the region. There's a great deal of upskilling that needs to be done and market development to tick this off as well, though.
Sure. And that's great that you're doing that. I mean, it's kind of the standard. Since the days of colonialism, the countries that are doing better are the ones that are those steps, 2 through 6 or 10 or so on. So if you can start developing that more in Africa, that'd be amazing. And Africa is where the future are. There's so many people there now, and it's where most people will be in the future. So if more things can be made there, the better. When it comes to talent development and market development, I was wondering what your approach to that is. I mean, you're already in the business of forestry, which in itself comes with a lot. So how do you engage the communities to develop talent and train them in these skills? And maybe you could just talk a little bit more about your approach there.
Sure. So maybe on 2 different levels, I think in terms of engaging with the communities, these are typically rural industrial jobs that we're training people for. Many of the universities in Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya have forestry schools, but the opportunities for people to develop, a broad array of skill sets or working for a multinational or really getting a flavor for what forestry could be is limited. So on the first hand, we will do training and technical upskilling of people living in proximity to the operations. On the more technical or professional side, we will usually, for middle management, be looking for well-trained, university-trained people in country and just providing them with some opportunities. So we've had some really good successes. A couple of examples of young, talented Tanzanians who we have sent to school in South Africa following their initial education, and they've come back and been just excellent foresters, excellent managers. At this point, the stronger forestry geographies on the continent are South Africa and probably Zimbabwe. So when we're looking at more senior management at this point, we'll still source quite a bit from those countries. But the intention is that they are passing theirs. As the role of expats is to pass your skills and knowledge along. And most of them are doing just that and training up some good teams around them.
Sure, that's phenomenal. I think it's so great that you're doing that. And I'm not sure if you mentioned, but they also are paying talent well above market rate. So definitely another great initiative. Going back to something you said previously about how several of the companies that had taken on a lot of debt have had to go through restructurings, or some may not even have survived. I was wondering, why is the New Forest company the only one, I think, in Africa that hasn't had to face restructuring? What would you attribute that success to?
Wow. I think the primary reason is that we have had a lot of very supportive shareholders over the years. We have a very supportive shareholder base, and they have been supportive over the years. A lot of the balance sheet restructuring, debt to equity success result that we've had would not have been possible if we had not had, people who feel good about what the company does, could see a longer term future for it. So, I would really attribute it to a strong and supportive shareholder base. And we do have a good and committed management team. And that's not to say that our peer companies have not, but certainly we do as well. And they've been in the trenches working through some pretty challenging times and have stayed with the company, which is really, I think, a testament to the culture of the company, but also feeling good about the work that they're doing.
Sure. I think working with the right people definitely helps. And clearly you've had a lot of success as a leader at the New Forest company, and even before that in your career. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your leadership style. How did that evolve over time? I didn't mention in the intro that you actually did an international directors program at NCED. So I was wondering if you just talk about, in general, different influences you've had over the years that led to you leading the way that you do. And
Sure, Nick. Thanks. I think you have to be exposed to what some of the differences are before you can articulate in yourself what you want to see or do. And I worked for a really excellent multinational company in North America. I worked for a couple of divisions in Canada as well as in South America. The company was called Weyerhaeuser. It's a German name, but a U.S. headquartered company. It's an old company, founded in 1904. And that was my first sort of large corporate experience. Prior to that, I'd been working for consultants. And I had a couple of mentors with that company who really focused on the advantages of collaborative leadership. They were very good at leading from beside you, not behind you or in front of you. And I had one in particular who laid out the role of a leader as setting direction, creating alignment to that direction, building capacity, and removing barriers. And so, I don't claim to have that in my mind all the time, but it's occasionally in the back of my mind. And I think my tendency is probably to be a collaborative leader and listen to the input and then guide accordingly. There are always exceptions. There are environments where you can really be highly delegative. If you've got a strong team, well experienced, then delegation is one thing. I think there are other circumstances where you have to step in and do some, tighter managing and be much more directive. So I guess there's a degree of flexibility, but my default and some of my strongest mentors were collaborative leaders. In terms of my INSEAD experience, I don't know if the International Directors Program did much necessarily to influence my leadership style. But it's certainly, it was a fantastic program, and you were interacting with 40 or 50 sharp, diverse people, coming through all industries, everything from nonprofit to private sector to education, a very international crew. And so you learn a lot from each other. You learn a lot from each other's experiences. I certainly learned, or increasingly am appreciating the value of cognitive diversity on boards of directors. Not that I was resistant to that previously, but getting the quantitative proof of how effective a diverse board can be was really interesting. So thoroughly enjoyed the program.
That's great. Yeah, I think that from what I've read, typically the best leadership trait is ability to listen and be sympathetic and attuned to the people you're working with. So that definitely makes sense. And although I'm sure, especially if you've been in a lot of different situations in different countries, sometimes that the style may need to change, but definitely agree there. I also totally agree on the point of seeing the need for cognitive diversity. I think that is kind of the benefit of these programs, is that you do get to interact with a lot of different types of people. So
yeah,
that
really amazing.
Maybe one last question is just, what plans do you have for the future with NFC? What would you like to accomplish personally that would make you happiest? If I could talk to you 10 years from now, what would you say would be the ideal outcome for New Forest Company?
I think our small and still relatively nascent industry has gone through a lot of challenges, a lot of different approaches in terms of types of investment. We have learned how to effectively plant trees in a region that doesn't have the experience of a North or South America or a Europe. We've learned how to work with communities effectively. I think what we need to do is show some longer term success on the downstream or the industrial side of the business, and actually turning this responsibly managed timber, these logs there, these trees that we are producing, into certified responsibly managed products that are being used in the region and internationally, and doing that at significant scale so that other investors, whether we look to the future and we're thinking IPO or we're thinking spinning off to pension funds, I think we need to create that consistency of economic success, because we need that to make the other legs of the tripod work. We need consistent economic success in order to be sustainable on the impact side and on the environmental side. So if I could look back in 10 years and we have done on the downstream side of the business in terms of market development what we've been able to do on the upstream side of the business in terms of forestry development, I think I would feel very, very rewarding.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. To stay up to date on events we may be hosting, emerging market news, and to build your personal network, please feel free to join the INSEAD Alumni Emerging Markets Interest Group on LinkedIn.